Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Frye, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest today is Christopher J. Ryan, Jr., Associate Professor of Law at Roger Williams University School of Law and an affiliated scholar with the American Bar Foundation. We will discuss his work on law school rankings, especially his article, A Value-Added Ranking of Law Schools. So welcome to the podcast, CJ.
Thanks for having me, Brian. Really excited to be here.
Yeah. Okay, so I know you've done a bunch of kind of econometric and statistical work on legal education. We're going to talk about specifically your work on law school rankings today. And I thought you could start by just explaining the first paper that I mentioned. What is a value-added ranking? What were you looking to measure in that paper?
So that's a great question. I was in a PhD program at Vanderbilt that I completed earlier this year. And that program focused on education policy, specifically using econometric methods to evaluate education. And in looking through my course materials for economics of education course that I took, I noticed a paper by Raj Chetty, who's an economist at Stanford, who had used this method of value added to model the success of teachers in the primary school setting. So, for example, if you have a student who's taken a standardized test in the third grade, let's say they got an 80 on the standardized test in the third grade, we might expect that student, all things sort of held at average, for that student to progress on the same test to maybe get an 85% by the time they were done with fourth grade. And what Raj Chetty's value-added rankings did, or value-added modeling did, was attribute the difference between the predicted student's fourth grade score and the actual student's fourth grade score to their fourth grade teacher. And so, in essence, this is a way of using the residual difference between an observed outcome and the predicted outcome to assign a value to a teacher. And I use the same logic to apply to law schools, because it's very difficult to get granular student level data at law schools and compare across law schools. So what my paper does is, and my method does, is it looks at the incoming attributes of a 1L class, such as their LSAT and their GPA. And I look at sort of three different cuts of each of those inputs: the 75th percentile, the median, and the 25th percentile of each of those inputs. And from those inputs, I predict how those same students would perform on bar passage and employment in JD required and JD advantage jobs. And then I examine those same students, that same cohort of students, 3 years later upon their graduation from law school, and look at their actual bar passage in their first two modal jurisdictions and their employment rates in the JD required and JD advantage jobs, and to observe the distance between the actual and predicted outcomes. And I, in essence, attribute that to the law school. Because if we think of law schools as a black box, they're taking in students and they're putting them out on the other end with a JD credential. What they do with them in the middle, in the intervening 3 years, is either add value or perhaps subtract value from those students. And this method is able to sort of assess the efficiency of the school based on the students they have at realizing outcomes that really matter to students, such as bar passage and employment. And this dovetails with some of my dissertation research in my PhD program, where I actually was trying to assess in one of my dissertation papers what sources of information students rely on in making their decision to enroll in law school, and what sort of outcomes are most salient to students in law schools across a variety of different typologies of law schools, elite law schools and public law schools and private law schools and so forth. And I find that those two things, bar passage and job placement, are super salient across sort of the different typologies of law schools and law students. So there's a little bit of sort of, you might say, method to my madness, why I chose those outcomes that weren't merely arbitrary.
Okay. So just to be really clear, what is your value-added ranking telling us or trying to tell us that other law school rankings maybe don't?
So I think that most law school rankings, and I'm thinking of primarily the U.S. News and World Report, which it has the first mover advantage, and so it has the greatest sort of number of people who follow it and attribute meaning to it. That type of ranking, and Above the Law has a similar ranking, and other journals do as well. Those types of rankings effectively are telling students, here is what a top law school should look like. It says nothing really about what the students care about, and many rankings are based upon reputation in some way. They include surveys in their methodology. They survey deans and professors, judges, lawyers, to ask them what their understanding of sort of on a scale of 1 to 5, where this law school should rank. And there is a tremendous amount of time invariance that is baked into those type of rankings, because very little is done to change people's opinion of a law school, even though there might be tremendous changes for the better or for the worse within a law school. And so all that to say, what my ranking does is it removes altogether the presence of a time invariant peer reputational score. And there are other rankings that do this too. Paul Caron and Bernard Black had a ranking that looked at law professor scholarship and sort of ranked law schools based on the you might say the ubiquity of the names that were residing faculty at the law school and how influential their research was. And you and I have, worked on another ranking system that doesn't have this same sort of baked in reputational factor. But really and truly what sets my rankings apart, I think, is the fact that it deals with a modern challenge that law schools face. And that is that they, out of necessity, have begun to admit students that they probably wouldn't have admitted 10 years ago. And the LSAT and the GPA medians across all schools has suffered somewhat, or to a greater extent at some schools in the last 10 years. And this method says, no matter the students you're taking, what are you doing with them, law schools? And arguably, if you're taking students who were, predicted to have less advantageous outcomes, and you're able to get them there regardless, that's something that's noteworthy. And really, in this sort of environment in which law schools presently operate, that's the type of questions that we should be asking and answering. And I think that's what my value-added rankings do.
Right. So if I'm understanding it correctly, then what you're saying is that your ranking is effectively telling students, how effective is this school at improving my performance in relation to what my kind of predicted performance would be. In other words, how much of a better lawyer or more likely to be successful lawyer is this school going to be?
I think that's a nice sort of summary of what it's attempting to do. At the same time, I sort of hesitate to say that it's telling students anything, right? Because I really and truly what it's doing is it's showing how much a school departs from its prediction, and I think that you can read that one of two ways, right? The first way is that you can read it. If you're a law student, if you're a consumer of these rankings as a law student, you can read it as saying these schools are going to get me where I want to be, regardless of my credentials coming in. And these schools are going to be better than those schools because the value-added rankings use actually standard deviation differences, not an ordinal scale the way other ranking systems do. So you can actually measurably see the schools that are better at this type of movement. But if you're a law school, another way you can read it is we're either performing or underperforming our prediction, and this is either sort of tenable or sustainable or not. And my concern is that in the hands of the wrong person, I think they could say, it sort of doesn't, this sort of thing doesn't matter because the students that we're admitting, we're taking them to the levels they need to, but that could be sort of a year blip. It's not, my rankings are very responsive to each cohort, and I expect them to change tremendously next year based on the new bar passage. And so I hesitate to say that you should read sort of anything into them on a perennial basis is really what I was trying to say.
Right. Well, I'm wondering, like, from the perspective, for example, of a student who might be considering law school, whose incoming LSAT scores are at the lower end of the test range. So a student who coming into law school is kind of predictively at risk of struggling with bar passage. On the margins, might they think that a school that performs better on the value added ranking might be more likely to provide them a benefit as a law school than a school that performs slightly less well?
Absolutely.
On the value added ranking?
Absolutely. And I think that would be a fair assumption to make. But mathematically speaking, there is sort of a caveat to that, which is, I don't know if you've noticed, but the top four are sort of some of the usual suspects: Harvard, Stanford, Yale. And the reason for that is, from a mathematical perspective, none of those schools have a perfect 180 on their LSAT measures. None of those schools have perfect 4.0s on their GPA measures of students. And as such, when they realize virtually 100% job placement and virtually 100% bar passage, they are still outperforming their prediction because their prediction started from less than perfect inputs, if you see what I'm saying. So, so as a result, it's not that these schools are sort of overperforming. They're doing just what you would expect them to do with their students. It's the schools that you wouldn't expect that crack the top 25 that are way overperforming. That I think students who were sort of on the margins in terms of their LSAT and their GPA, that they could look to those schools and say, this school was really good at preparing its students in this year for the outcomes that matter to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like so many rankings, it seems like there's an awful lot of stickiness at the top end of the ranking, and often a lot more variance when you go farther down the rankings list. How closely did your assessment correlate with other rankings metrics? I mean, did you find that there was a pretty close correspondence with, say, U.S. News or Above the Law or any of the other ranking systems, or did you see schools performing differently?
I did run a correlation number to get a correlation coefficient between my rankings and U.S. News and War Report. But I did that so long ago now, I'm forgetting exactly what the correlation coefficient was. It wasn't very high. It was a mid-range number. I think it was in the 0.4 or 0.5, meaning that these things are not perfectly correlated. In fact, it might have even been much lower than that, if memory serves. But I do include in the rankings a column that lists the school's U.S. News and World Report ranking. And you'll notice I also include a column that has the change from, let's say they were a particular school was 15th in the U.S. News and World Report rankings, but comes in at 25th in mine. There would be the change would be -10, and so I include those two columns for the readers to look at and examine and sort of does it pass the eye test, or whether there's a strong correlation there. And my answer is there really isn't. There is a bit of stickiness at who is at the very top, but those top four are closely followed by schools like Southern University Law Center and Faulkner University, in schools that traditionally are nowhere near the top 100 even.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you've seen in your rankings, then you saw that some schools significantly outperformed others in terms of their ability to improve student performance.
That's right. And a lot of this has to do with those schools taking students from really sort of historically low credentials, LSAT and GPA, and still preparing those students to pass the bar, and still preparing those students for careers in law and matching them with those careers. So again, this is something of an artifice of the math behind this, but a school that would be predicted to have very low rates of both bar passage and job placement, say around 25%, because they're at the 25th percentile of all schools based on LSAT and GPA, that overperform on those metrics would sort of benefit from the biggest gain. And, I think I referenced Southern Law Center. They rank 5th in my value-added rankings. They're basically a full standard deviation and then some from where they were predicted to be, which is substantial. And there are a number of other schools that that we would expect to sort of round out the top 10. Virginia and Columbia, for instance, come in at 9 and 10 respectively. But there are several schools that maybe we would not. The John Marshall Law School in Atlanta ranks at 17, Ave Maria at 18. And these are schools that traditionally are not ranked by the U.S. News and World Report, but that have benefited from significantly outperforming their predicted outcomes.
Well, clearly that ought to matter for incoming students, right? You want to choose the school that's more likely to help you to succeed than the one that's not on the margins. What about from the perspective of the schools themselves, from the school administrations, or from the perspective of policymakers? Are there ways you think that they could use your study productively?
So I'll start by discussing the policymaker perspective, because I have a colleague, a friend really. He came through the same PhD program that I did at Vanderbilt, and now he works at Emory University after having worked at their law school. But he's in the provost office. I'm not exactly recalling his title right now, but Justin Shepard has cited to my paper in using stochastic modeling estimation of the efficiency of law schools. And he does so in a comparative context. So he actually assigns an efficiency coefficient to law schools in terms of these same questions based on the student's undergraduate GPA and the student's LSAT and the student's GPA within their time in law school. How efficient is the law school at producing students that go into careers in the law and are bar pass ready, and so it's already being used in that respect. It's sort of you might say inspired other research in this area, and as far as law schools themselves, I think this is actually as important to them as it is to a potential consumer, like a potential law student would be, or prospective law student would be. I think this really tells law schools, if we think of ourselves as a black box, is the information we're baking in to students and the education we're inculcating into them and the preparation that we're giving them, is it working out the way we think it is? And if not, what steps can we be doing to sort of improve students' bar passage? And this is actually a very live question. Many law schools are trying to figure out, what the secret sauce is in preparing students for the bar. This was a historically low year in terms of bar passage. And so I think this is a worthwhile endeavor for law schools to figure out the extent to which they need to dedicate resources that prepare their students for the very reasons they come to law school, to be bar pass ready and to have a career in law.
Yeah, I mean, it seems especially for kind of schools with historically lower credential incoming classes, with the ABA threatening sort of de-accreditation of schools that don't meet minimum bar passage rates. This seems like it might be a pretty salient bit of information.
I would agree, and it's something that has generated interest. I know that Paul Caron posted it in his blog when it was first written, my ranking system, and Above the Law posted about it, and it's generated discussion because this is sort of the first real application of an econometric approach to evaluating law schools' efficiency. And so I hope that it continues to inspire and engender conversation about what it is that we're doing in law schools to best prepare our students for their careers.
Right, right. So you and I worked on another law school ranking system, which we referred to as a revealed preferences ranking. And I was wondering if you could describe for listeners sort of what that means, how the sort of the ranking system was put together, and what it's trying to tell us.
So revealed preferences is another economic term. And what that means is that through action, economic actors reveal their preferences at the risk of sounding redundant, what it is that matters to them. And so our rankings, the revealed preferences rankings that you and I worked on, Brian, was sort of a way of analyzing in a way that no other ranking system has, somewhat subjectively, what it is that law students with the best credentials, where it is they enroll. So if we think that the best law schools are those that are most successful at enrolling the best students, where is it that these best students are enrolling on the basis of their GPA and LSAT? And if we think of their GPA and LSAT as some sort of currency or purchasing power, where are they spending it? So that's what our rankings were responsive to, and it was a really sort of interesting thought experiment, and one that I was pleased to work on with you. And what we did with those rankings is that we looked at the sort of 6 cuts of those two important inputs, GPA and LSAT. We looked at the 75th, the median, and the 25th percentile for every school's incoming 1L class. And we created a composite based on the standardized or Z-scored metrics of each of those inputs. And in doing so, we were able to again scale on a normal distribution with standard deviation differences, the distance that exists between schools on the basis of those inputs. And so what we were attempting to do is to see, does this shake up in a meaningful way the U.S. News and World Report rankings? Does this move the needle on who the T14 are and so forth? And what we found is that actually, yes, it does. And there are a variety of sort of narratives that we were able to craft to explain why our rankings came out the way we did. And principally, I think some of the interesting findings that we found are that law students might prefer a particular school because of its location or affiliation, and not because of its sort of reputation, which is a heavily relied upon factor in the U.S. News and World Report rankings. And to that end, some of the schools that come to mind are Notre Dame and BYU are affiliated with churches, and those schools had higher GPA and LSAT relative to their peers in the U.S. News and World Report ranking, and therefore they were ranked higher in our revealed preferences ranking because students affiliated with those churches might be more inclined to attend law school at a law school affiliated with their church. I think Baylor also outperformed in this area as well. And a school that jumped out to me, being a native Texan and Dallasite, is that SMU performed well above its U.S. News and World Report ranking in our rankings, simply because at the time it was the only ABA accredited really law school of any notoriety in Dallas, and even of the DFW Metroplex. Although Texas A&M in Fort Worth has sort of crept in and taken its share of the market as well. But SMU did it remarkably well because it's the school that people who want to practice in the fourth largest metropolitan area in the country would want to go to.
Right. And that seems to dovetail with what you described as being some of your current work in your dissertation, looking at the factors that are salient to students. What kind of further research have you done in that area?
So I'm actually in the process of finalizing that article for the February submission cycle for law reviews. And so the article that I referenced, or the part of my dissertation that I referenced, was a survey to 4 different law schools. One was a private sort of elite law school. Another was a public flagship law school. Another was a public regional law school. And the last was sort of a private newer law school. And those correspond with about 4 of the 6 typologies of law schools that really exist. And also, they also corresponded with the different, if we think of the 200 ABA accredited law schools in the country, divided into 4 tiers of the top 50 by U.S. News and World Report, the next 50, the last 100, and last 50. They corresponded in each of those categories as well. So they were illustrative cases, I think, of many of the types of schools that exist in those sort of peer pockets or peer tiers. And the reason why I surveyed those schools was because of their representativeness. And I found that, and the survey was really geared toward getting a sense of what sources of information students rely upon when they're going to law school. Why do they go to law school? What outcomes are they most interested in? What is their sort of sense about risk aversion? I captured information on their grades and sort of student loan debt and their responsiveness to scholarship as being a way of defraying the cost of law school. So really, it was a very comprehensive survey. It was 31 questions, but I really ran the gamut on what I wanted to cover. And this first paper that I'm writing on that survey research addresses that, and it addresses law school choice in that framework from both sort of an economic decision as well as a decision about one's career, one's desires, as well as an informational asymmetry decision. Law schools have a lot of information, some of which they give to prospective law students, and how effective is that information at being disseminated to influence law students' decisions. So I think it's a really sort of important descriptive and associational piece. And it's been, over a year of working on now. I disseminated this survey in October of 2017. So I've had a year to sort of think about these questions, and it was very well received. That the response rate was over 40%, which is remarkably high. And that's for all students at each of those 4 law schools. So it was a really successful research endeavor. And that's something that I'm looking forward to putting out this spring. I have 2 other papers for my dissertation that I'll eventually sort of trickle out, and once they're ready for publication in a law review, that's exactly where I hope to place them. And they deal with effectively the analysis of whether, from a law school's perspective, financial aid is an efficient motivator for students to enroll and matriculate at a law school, which is a really important question to answer for law schools. And the last paper looks at the near-term and long-term labor market returns of going to law school, and specifically the types of law schools in which students enrolled. And for that, I use not my own data. In the second paper, I used the ABA 509 disclosure data. In this last paper, I used the After the JD study, which was done by researchers at the American Bar Foundation. It was in conjunction with the Access Lex and Northwestern Law School and a handful of other institutes were involved. I think NALP also was involved. But that study looks at the 2000 cohort of law school graduates and assesses them at 3 points in their career, some 12 years on, including into their career. And so it's now it's almost 4-year-old data that I'm looking at, but it's a really important sort of economic question about the sociology of the profession and the sociology of the education that these students, as law students, received, and how that impacts their career some 12 years on as lawyers and other professionals. So those are the three main papers that comprise my dissertation, but they'll be sort of, as I said, trickling out over the next maybe year or so. And then I've also got a handful of other projects that I'm working on. One's through the American Bar Foundation, where I'm looking at the after tenure study, which a colleague of mine, Beth Mertz, did, where a colleague, Megan Daw, and I are trying to predict the what causes a law faculty member to either leave their institution, we call this mobility, and go to another law school, or attrit altogether from teaching in the legal academy. And so that paper is sort of in its middle stages. I'm also doing an investigation with a colleague of mine, Chris Marsicano, where we're looking at the fair market value impact of endowment divestment from fossil fuels, which is sort of a live question, and it has some normative implications as well. And then finally, Mike Simkovic and I, who's a colleague at USC's law school, are conducting a categorization and really an analysis of law schools' specialties based on their sort of human capital allocations to disciplinary areas within the law. And so that's been sort of a fun data project to work on as well. So I'm keeping very busy in addition to teaching my first year of property this spring.
Wow. Well, it's going to be a lot of information for law school administrators to be processing as you get these papers out. I'm sure it's going to be really useful for people to see all the results that you find. Yeah. So I was wondering, CJ, in closing, you mentioned that you had an opportunity to talk to someone from U.S. News and World Report lately. And I was wondering if you could just briefly describe that interaction and sort of what, if anything, you learned from it.
Well, actually, I was invited to be a part of a panel at the Access Lex Institute's most recent research symposium in Scottsdale, Arizona. And the other members of the panel included Justin Shepard, who I referenced is at Emory, and Bob Morse, who is the chief data strategist at U.S. News and World Report. Paul Caron, who's dean at Pepperdine, was also invited, but he was attending to his law school's needs during the really tragic fires in the Malibu area. And so Bob, Justin, and I were on the panel, and I think it was a really productive and useful conversation about what are rankings, what should they be, and what should they be in the law school context. And I had some slides prepared in which I discussed the issues, and particularly, in my view, the issues of the inherent and sort of perverse incentives that are within the U.S. News and World Report's law school rankings. And we've seen evidence of law schools sort of gaming the rankings in terms of how they report, as well as the ways in which they construct these workarounds to the different metrics used in the U.S. News and World Report methodology. And I had the opportunity to address that with Bob, and in front of an audience, and as well as to describe sort of what I think, when I think law school rankings are most successful. And I think rankings are most successful when they're salient to stakeholders. And that includes sort of a wide perspective of who stakeholders are. Obviously, prospective and current students should be at the forefront of our thought when we think about ranking law schools. But we should as well consider faculty and administrators of law schools. Their perspectives might be different than, and certainly I think indeed are different than a student's perspective on rankings. Additionally, the public is an important stakeholder, as well as the practicing profession and graduates of law schools. So for myriad reasons, I think instead of having one ranking that addresses all of those people as U.S. News tries to do, I think we ought to have multiple rankings that are salient to each specific stakeholder group, or at least some small combination of them. And that's what my rankings try to do. And my sort of view is that my rankings are not the only way to look and at and be salient to the stakeholder groups that my rankings address. But my view is to let 1,000 flowers bloom. I think that there should be a greater sort of discussion and use of data to be able to identify the law schools that are successful in this sort of modern context. And to that end, I think Access Lex is working on sort of a data dashboard that would allow a prospective student to compile information that is salient to them and at least in a head-to-head way compare law schools. And that sort of tool, I think, is a step in the right direction.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, CJ. I look forward to reading the avalanche of papers you seem to have coming.
Well, I'm always intrigued by your work, Brian, and we need to get together again soon. It's a pleasure to speak with you today and also to call you my colleague and friend.
A new kind of cool, a new kind of cool.
A new kind of cool from British Sterling. Bitter lemon, aftershave and cologne.
A new kind of cool, bitter lemon. A new kind of cool.
A fresh, enduring cool that goes beyond lime.
A new kind of cool called bitter lemon. Cool, fresh and lasting. It go away beyond lime. Cool, fresh and lasting. It called bitter lemon.
Bitter lemon, aftershave and cologne.
A new kind of cool, let me tell you, man. It called bitter lemon.
New from British Sterling.
Da, 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 do, do, dee, ding, ding. Da, dee, 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 dee.